Well, I am so happy to be with you today. And as we get started, I thought I better introduce myself in case not everyone knows me. I'm Diane Leonard. I'm the president and owner of DH Leonard Consulting and Grant Writing Services, and also, strange side passion, a licensed Scrum trainer. And so in 2018, we launched an additional product. Our business has been around for about 15 years, focusing on grants and capacity building, but we started focusing on Agile and the Scrum framework as a way to help nonprofits focus on their impact and how they could increase their capacity. And so when we think about how it is that we're teaching nonprofits, showing them what's possible, the case studies are a really important way that we can engage and help demonstrate some options for what nonprofit professionals might consider in their own Agile journey. So it's a little bit about why we wanted to do today's interview, and I'm thrilled to have one of our trainers with us, Jessica Crowley.
Hi, so I'm Jessica Crowley, as Diane said, and I'm an enterprise Agile coach and licensed Scrum trainer as well. And I am on the Agile Nonprofits team. I'm super excited to announce that we have Eric Ressler with us. He is the founder and creative director of Cosmic. How are you doing today, Eric?
I'm doing really well. I'm so glad that you guys reached out to me and that we were able to connect. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation.
Absolutely. I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about yourself and maybe some of your Agile experience.
Totally. So I run Cosmic. I'm the founder and creative director, and Cosmic is a social impact creative agency. So we work with primarily nonprofits, social enterprises, and foundations, and we help them to catalyze real world change through the work that we do together. And primarily we're focused on helping these organizations really nail their impact story, build brand awareness, and then inspire action at scale through the lens of design and strategy and technology.
That's so exciting and inspiring. And as this idea came forward, I'm like, oh, this is so fun to find how, for-profits, socially minded for-profits can help create impact and change in a different way. And so when I read your article, which is why we sprint and why your nonprofit should too, I was like, yes, we're not just talking about running, we're talking about Agile and sprints. This is great. And so I got really excited about how you were exposing nonprofits to the idea of Agile, to what it looks like to sprint, to help make sure folks know we're not literally talking about running, and that you're seeing clients continue this even after maybe a project is done. And we've seen a similar sort of thing. So I'd love to hear your take on how do you talk about this with your clients? How do you help them understand what a sprint is? What does that look like for you and your team?
Totally. So, I think really what's interesting to me about all of this is that there's kind of the strict Scrum Agile philosophy, and there's a bunch of different levels that you can go there. And I think that for us, what we found is kind of adopting a hybrid Agile approach actually works the best. And I think that's largely because we're in a consultative engagement with our clients. We're working with them as an agency. We're working with them on fixed projects. We're not internal into the team. And so I think, what we've found is that going back to the early days of Cosmic, and, we just turned about 10 years old as an agency, we found pretty quickly that we needed a process to work with our clients that would allow us to have open channels of communication, to stay in touch, to, keep project momentum going. Because we found that without that, clients were confused about what was happening next, what our progress was, when they needed to be available. And so that really, we drew some inspiration from the Agile world and the concept of sprints as a way to have a weekly cadence to our work and to have a check-in that we could, commit to on a weekly basis. And that's where it really started. And then from there, we found that some of the other principles of Agile were also quite helpful in terms of focusing on having action and on building things and demoing work in progress versus the traditional kind of Mad Men style agency model where, we do our research and go away for 3 months and come back with this big unveil and hope that the client buys it. And that's not really a good approach with the type of work that we do. It doesn't create this more collaborative work environment between the agency and the client where we really become one team. And so, that's kind of a long-winded answer in terms of how we got started. When we talk to our clients about the concepts of sprints, it kind of depends on the client and how much experience they have. Some of our clients come from we're based in Silicon Valley, and some of our clients come actually out of tech startups or doing work where their internal engineering team maybe was running sprints and now they've moved on to work within a nonprofit. Other times, we're working with nonprofit leaders and stakeholders who have never heard of the concept of sprints. So there is a little bit of an educational process, but when we kind of frame it in terms of it, from their perspective, mostly being kind of just a standing weekly check-in meeting and a demo meeting, that makes a lot of sense to them. And then from there, we can kind of build on that and start to tell them more about why we do it that way. And ultimately, when we have deeper relationships with our clients and they see how effective that can be with our project, oftentimes they take that same methodology and start to bring it internally into their program work that they're doing that doesn't involve us at all.
Absolutely. So in terms of the article saying more about project collaboration and efficiency, so can you tell me a little bit more and dig into that with these nonprofits? What are they taking away from it? What is the experience like when they work with you? Why do you think they're getting, their feet wet and then loving it?
I think that the concept of sprints and Agile, it creates this very rapid generation of progress that maybe isn't always shared experience with the way that some nonprofits are used to working. So, and this is generalizing, but sometimes nonprofits can get very caught up in processes and stakeholders and, bringing a lot of different people in to the project to get various opinions. And I think there's a lot of merit to that, especially when we're talking about equity and wanting to make sure that the projects that we're building are serving the communities we're hoping to serve. But the downsides of too much of that process or too much wonkiness or too much like academia in the process is that oftentimes a lot of work will be done around planning and around strategy, but there's not the right processes in place to make sure that the results of that work are actually serving the people that the work is meant to serve. And so one of the things that's really interesting to me about Agile is that Agile and design thinking have a lot of overlap, and design thinking is, another methodology that's really kind of built on empathy as its foundation, and really making sure that you're understanding the user's needs, or in the case of social impact, the people that you're trying to benefit, or the sector that you're trying to improve, and really getting into the weeds quickly. And rather than doing these large projects where you step away and plan and take 6 months to build something and then release it, you're doing a much more rapid build it and test it and prototype and get things in front of people sooner than later. And that just results in a much more interesting and oftentimes more effective approach. And it can often mean that things are happening in a much more rapid fashion, and you're able to make progress much more quickly and maintain momentum of the project. And that's what we've seen become really effective for the nonprofits that we work with.
It sounds like now that you've used sprints, you would never want to not use them.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly times where sprints might be difficult. Like, for example, when we do branding projects, that's a little bit more difficult to do in an agile fashion. That is the kind of thing where we need to step away and, we do hundreds of sketches and we do a lot of, landscape analysis. But we do still try and have at least the weekly check-in to kind of demo some things and talk about what we're doing. So, I think generally speaking, like, we always employ sprints. The only other situation that I can see where we don't follow it quite as much is in our diagnostic work, where we're just doing discovery work. It doesn't really make sense to check in weekly or to work in a sprint fashion at times. But in general, that's our go-to approach for any project work that we're doing. And I would say that, yeah, I would never go back to a non-sprint kind of general approach to our work.
Interesting. And so if sprints are where you're seeing the easiest connection in terms of how you structure your work and how you communicate with your nonprofit clients, I'm curious, kind of behind the scenes then within Cosmic, are there other Agile principles, values that you're bringing to the table sort of as a second step that seems like a natural place where you're interacting? You mentioned sort of requirements, processes, stakeholders. I've heard some of those key words out of values and principles. So if sprinting is kind of the structure, where do you see that conversation being most productive next?
I think it is in some of those topics that you just mentioned. So, I mean, one of the other things that I think is very aligned with Agile is getting the right stakeholders in the room and really deeply engaged in the project throughout the process, because the last thing we want to do is work with, either silo our work or work with the wrong stakeholders within our partner organizations and build something just to have it be kind of shut down or, massively restructured when a decision maker gets brought in 3/4 of the way down the process. So the challenge is that oftentimes those decision makers are executive directors or CEOs, and their time is limited. And so sometimes what we'll need to do is we'll bring them in early on in some of the planning and prototyping phase or discovery phase to make sure that we have alignment around the outcomes that we're working towards, and then they can join at some of the more meaningful sprints where we might be doing, a first look at a prototype or an unveiling of a creative direction for a brand. So I think, stakeholder engagement is one that's really important. I think also just kind of having a bias towards doing rather than overthinking. And certainly there needs to be a balance, because all of our work is definitely strategic, but we want to make sure that we're not making too many assumptions and that we're checking our biases. So we do that by having a combination of research and discovery work, sometimes surveys, sometimes doing qualitative interviews with the people that we're hoping to serve, and then quickly building things, even if they're not perfect, and getting them prototyped and then demoing that to the client. And then sometimes those exact stakeholders and people that we mentioned earlier, as well as any of the folks that we may have interviewed who would ultimately be using what it is that we're building. So to me, that's kind of the next level outside of sprints. Sprints are really just the structure of how we work and how we schedule work. The other thing that's nice about sprints that we haven't really touched on yet is that it kind of forces you to break down large projects into smaller chunks, which is really important for estimation and just making progress in general. So, one of the concepts in Agile is that every sprint you have demoable progress, right? So something that you can show and interact with and demo. And so that means that we need to be able to break down our work into small enough chunks that we can create something each week that we can actually demo to our client or demo to other stakeholders.
Yeah, it hits so hard. One of our favorite things to ask if we're talking to a client where we're offering grant writing support and they're new to us, so who actually is going to be the final stakeholder that says this is ready to hit submit? Because
right.
We want them to be aware of and probably see V1 where it's messy and there's questions, and they need to know, to quote Gretchen Rubin, who's one of my favorite authors, right? We're going to target progress, not perfection. And so that they understand where you're starting from, but we know they're the ones ultimately, because if they don't see it till the end, even if it's beautiful, they didn't see it till the end, and they might say, not quite right. Right?
Yeah, so right.
I love what you've just described for the value and why and the cadence, but also that interaction. Absolutely.
Totally.
Like ditto. I agree.
I think what it comes down to at the end of the day that might be interesting for listeners to consider is that it's really about trust, right? It's about, and at some level being vulnerable, especially in an agency client relationship. But even if you want to start to bring some of these agile methodologies internally within your nonprofit, you have to be open to showing things that are a little bit messy, that are not perfect yet. And I think ultimately what we've seen is that results in a better product in the end, but you do need to kind of set expectations around like, hey, this isn't going to be a polished 30-slide presentation necessarily. It might be some wireframes, or it might be an early draft, or it might be, a demo that we know there's some things that aren't perfect yet, but we'd rather get it in front of you sooner so that we can make sure that we've got the broad strokes right before we get caught up in the details. And as a designer, I care a lot about the details. The details in my mind are actually what ends up making something great instead of just good. But you have to make sure that you're ready to hit the details before you start to do that. So I think it does come back to trust though. And, oftentimes what we'll find is that when we first work with a new client, we'll start with some, just some sprints and some lighter agile methodologies. We'll make sure that by the time we are demoing things, they're a little bit more polished. But as we grow our trust between our clients and ourselves, we open up more collaboration and we open up more agile methodologies, and that generally works, but you do need to earn the trust first.
Actually, that makes me think of one of these books that I've got right here is Fearless Organization by Amy Edmondson. Right? It talks all about psychological safety and what that creates like within your own team is one thing, but then for how you create that with your external stakeholders when you're getting started,
Right.
we're going to have a separate conversation another day over a cup of coffee. I'm like, don't get me started. I'm like, you hit it right on the nail, like right on the head.
Awesome.
One thing I was thinking when you were mentioning how some of the nonprofits will work with you in these sprints and then adapt this and take it away. Do you have examples of some nonprofits that have used or worked with you and then walked away with implementing sprints?
Yeah, definitely. So we did some work with our local, so we were based in Santa Cruz, and the economic development department here in Santa Cruz, we did a large bit of work with a few years back. And they were so inspired by just the working relationship and how much we were able to achieve together. We launched a new brand, a large website, a video series, about 4,000 photos across the entire city within about 16 weeks, which is pretty aggressive from start to finish. And so they were really impressed by how much work we were able to do together. And we, quickly identified that part of the reason that worked so well is because we did establish that trust. We had done a small pilot project before this one, so we already had a little bit of trust going into it. Certainly their team came in with an open, collaborative mindset and were willing to put that trust in us and vice versa, and to really just kind of put the end product above all else. Egos were set aside, and we really just wanted to build something good together. And so they were inspired by that process, and it was very successful for them. And so they realized that they had an opportunity to kind of take some of those methodologies that we had used on our client work together and bring them into their internal team. So they very quickly started by just setting up a weekly standing meeting, and where they were able to both demo progress on their individual initiatives, because there were various stakeholders involved that were in charge of different parts of the work happening within their organization, but also to just make it a space where people could bring up whatever was blocking them from being able to make progress in a very authentic and safe space style approach. And so those two small steps together really helped them to build some capacity and to make sure that they weren't blocking each other on their work, and to also know that they had that standing meeting so that if something did come up, if it wasn't urgent, they had a place they knew they could bring it up. And so that also creates some efficiencies outside of those sprint meetings where you don't need to schedule and call a separate meeting necessarily, and just all the back and forth and kind of context switching that's a result of scheduling a meeting, which we all have to do many times a week as it is. And just to have that kind of collaborative team spirit going into those weekly meetings, even just that small change made a huge effect on their capacity and their effectiveness.
That's incredible, right? And like, if you stop to think, so not only did you create something beautiful that was then putting them forward on their goals, but then to hear the stories of how that changed the way that they work, right? To think about what that means for that community and being able to come together and just think about the act of removing an impediment.
Yes.
Right? And like, there's the social impact of it's so cool. We're Agile and nonprofit passionate people, so you're going to get us all excited, like-minded folks. And so when you think about the work that you've done and how you're interacting with the nonprofits, I mean, we're so grateful to hear just a little bit about your experience, your story, how you're teaching nonprofits by doing, right? You're teaching them by example.
Yeah.
Closing thoughts or ideas that you want to make sure that as we're sharing with our colleagues and with the nonprofits that are thinking about Agile, what would you say to them? What are your big ideas here for them to consider?
Well, I would say that really, if you're running a nonprofit and you're trying to create additional capacity or effectiveness, that one of the things you could really look at is some of these Agile methodologies. And I think one of the big takeaways for me is that if you start to look into Agile, it can become really overwhelming really quickly, because there's a lot of depth there and there's good reason for that depth. And, it's largely based around building software products, and that might not in its original form, right? And so that might feel very irrelevant to you if you're trying to create social impact with regards to ending child poverty in a third world country, for example, right? That seems very disparate. But It really isn't, because it's more about a philosophy of how to create progress and how to actually build things more efficiently, which can be applicable to really any industry or any sector. And then secondly, you don't need to go from 0 to 100. You can really start to incrementally bring some of these methodologies in and see some progress. And that's what we've done. We're not a Scrum shop necessarily. Like, we don't have certifications around this stuff, but what we've done is we've looked at some of those ideas and those philosophies, and we've figured out what parts of them make sense for us in our organization and the way that we work with our clients. And I think if I were in charge of a nonprofit, or a main stakeholder around operations at a nonprofit, or even in charge of a particular program or initiative, I would look at these ideas and these philosophies and see if there's parts of it that could help my team make a bigger impact more effectively.
I think you better be careful, Eric, because I think that there might be nonprofit board offers coming your way. So you'll have to decide, like, which boards am I going to sit on? I'm just saying that might happen as an unintended consequence of today's conversation.
Totally. Well,
yeah.
I think it's really great that you guys are able to put some focus around this, because I do think there's a lot of opportunity here. And, our business is really focused more on partnering with these organizations and, through the lens of branding and communications. And that's kind of our niche and our focus. But I do see there's so much potential here. We just don't have the capacity, and it's not really our core focus in terms of helping our clients in this way. We focus more on outward communications than inward, methodologies or consulting. So it's really great to make the connection. And certainly, I think there's a lot of potential for you guys to help people move their organizations forward with some of these methodologies.
Yeah. Well, whether formal, right? Whether we're talking about licensed, or whether we're just saying, like, just to even think about it, read a book, listen to a podcast, right? I mean, it's an Agile journey. And so wherever a nonprofit staffer or board member is willing to start is the perfect place, right?
Totally.
So you're helping them to find their start. We're here if they've got formal questions or just to give the nudge. And that's all we can do, right? I mean, we've got a great idea, I think, in just a different way to support nonprofit capacity. But it's been such a pleasure to talk with you and get to hear about some of your work, and to think about how, like, the case studies, the visual work you have on your website is beautiful by itself, but then to understand the backstory for what you're doing for social impact through those interactions, like I said, we'll have to just have coffee another time and really just, it's fantastic. And I'm so grateful again for your time. So Jessica, any closing thoughts?
No, but just, if they haven't read the article, I do recommend that they take a minute to look it up and read it. It's an easy read. You can read it in about 10 minutes and take away a lot of tactics for, as a nonprofit, how can you sprint and how can you start doing that today? So thank you so much, Eric.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.